tried hard to raise my siblings and me in a household that appreciated intellectual inquiry and opposed the laziness of stereotyping. I think they liked diversity, at least to an extent. I think they liked in junior high that my best friends and I made a nice little interfaith group. I was the Protestant, Larry was the Catholic, Evan was the Jew, and John was the agnostic. So we had 4 great traditions. I suppose agnosticism is a great tradition. Represented. The one place where religious stereotyping managed to find its way into our lives and to take root in my life, where a lack of religious understanding managed to become prejudice, was around Catholics and saints. Why would someone pray to a saint when you can address God directly? Were saints being made into demigods? Somewhere along the way I got the message that this practice, this reverence for saints, was at least silly and potentially wrong or even bad. When I got to college, a Catholic classmate encouraged me to ignore the official process of the Catholic Church that they take to make someone a saint officially, to recognize them. And he suggested instead to think of saints simply as exemplars of faithfulness. Then years later, I read an article in the Christian Century in which the author suggested that praying to a saint could be reframed as simply inviting those that are part of the church eternal to pray with you, just like you invite members of your church temporal, the church here, to pray for you and pray with you. I think that is the way to understand what the author of the letter of Hebrews is getting at. The list that Mike read of all these cloud of witnesses, all these people of faith, all these exemplars of faith, actually started 20 verses earlier, and we skipped a whole bunch of it. And we get into the final point that the author of the letter of the Hebrews is making, that we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, these people that have gone before us, these people who were faithful, this community of exemplars. In other words, we have models of how to run the race, how to persevere, of how to remain faithful in all kinds of circumstances. And that's how I've come to regard sainthood. For me, saints are people, dead and living, who are exemplars of faithfulness. And as a good Congregationalist, I realize that my list of saints is probably different from your list of saints, but that's fine. In this sermon series, Pastor Brendan and I are going to lift up 10 people who we regard as exemplars of faith. We are going to tell you a little bit about them, some aspects of their faithfulness that we think you individually and we collectively might want to reflect on during Lent, some aspects of their lives and words that we can see as an invitation to a challenge to deepen our faithfulness. So today we look at Benedict of Nursia and Teresa of Avila. I did not know much about Teresa of Avila before I started this sermon series, working on this sermon series, other than her reputation of being a deep mystic and being recognized as a doctor of the church by the Catholic Church, and which is something I was kind of surprised that they recognized a woman as a doctor of the church. I may learn more about how unusual that is or not unusual. The truth be told, I still don't know a whole lot about her. She was born in Spain 2 years before the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. This was just years after the Spanish victory over the Moors and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. It was a time when Spain was exultantly and aggressively Catholic, and the power of women was negligible. Somehow, Teresa managed to outshine nearly all her contemporaries. Educated in a local convent after her mother died, Teresa decided to become a nun at the age of 20. Her father did not approve. She did it anyway, She ran off and joined the Carmelite convent in Avila. After some time away from the convent because of an illness that almost killed her, she returned to the convent, and she found a convent that really was not encouraging her spiritual life. The original rule under which Carmelite communities functioned had been watered down with exemptions and exceptions, and one biographer says that the convent was more like a boarding house for wealthy maidens than a house of prayer, which at first worked just fine for Teresa because she was a heavy extrovert and loved being social. That was until her 40th year of life. That year she had an experience, a conversion experience. One day she happened to glance at an image of the suffering Christ. Instantly she was filled with loathing for the mediocrity of her spiritual life, and she determined to devote herself to a serious life of prayer. Almost immediately upon this resolution, she began to experience the sensation of God's love transforming her from within. She decided to establish a new Reformed Carmelite house, returning to the spirit of the original primitive rule of Carmel. After strenuous lobbying, she finally got permission to undertake this initiative, and her new convent was founded in Avila in 1562. Her new community was known as the Discalcid Carmelites, meaning shoeless. And no, they weren't Black Sox that played Shoeless Joe Jackson, what I'm thinking of. But they actually did wear shoes. They had hemp sandals, but they referred to as shoeless Carmelites because one of their rules was a vow of poverty, and in strict poverty. That was a feature of Teresa's reform. Her nuns would seek no endowments but live entirely on alms and their own labor. A strict enclosure was to be maintained, along with a vegetarian diet and a rigorous schedule of prayer. I'm not surprised that her rule for her convents focused on prayer. It was vital to her personally. It was through her rigorous prayer life that she had repeated mystical experiences. She described her spiritual ecstasies and other spiritual experiences in great detail in her autobiography, along with several other volumes on prayer and mystical spirituality. In this picture of her, you notice she's writing. She was published, which was unusual just in general in the 1500s, but particularly for a woman. But she's also having an ecstatic experience with the Holy Spirit represented by the dove sort of whispering in her ear and the cross of Jesus before her. For someone who achieved a virtually unique degree of communion with God, she still managed to be able to talk about it in common terms. She wrote, in translation of course, "Prayer, in my view, is nothing but friendly intercourse and frequent solitary converse with him we know loves us." Benedict lived 1,000 years before Teresa. He was born just after the fall of the Roman Empire in what is now central Italy. When the Roman Empire fell, there was an authority vacuum, and through the gift of his rule for monastic communities, Benedict may well share responsibility for monastic communities to being what filled that authority vacuum in what had been the Roman Empire. Like Teresa, Benedict was born to a distinguished family, and like Teresa, he left his social position in order to pursue a deeper relationship with God. This first took the form of being a hermit, but somehow he attracted the attention of other spiritual seekers, and they would find him in his cave or wherever he was. And at one point over these years, he was even induced to become the leader of a monastic community. It did not work out. He was too strict. Eventually, he agreed to organize spiritual seekers who came to him to form monasteries, and one of the monasteries he organized is the now famous monastery at Monte Cassino. It was there that he wrote his famous rule, a rule that became the standard for Western monastic traditions. Whereas earlier monastic experiments had stressed rigorous asceticism and often superhuman self-denial, Benedict's rule was designed for ordinary human beings. The element of discipline was shifted from externals to the internal, from the flesh to the will. His monks were not denied adequate food or sleep. They were, in fact, counseled to avoid any extraordinary or self-imposed mortifications. Their discipline was to lie in humility, in obedience, in a commitment to stability, and in an accommodation to the requirements of community life. Benedict put a high value on hospitality, urging monks and sisters to view strangers as Christ himself coming to them, coming to stay in their communities. Guests are to be received as they are and for who they are. There is no mandate to require guests to participate in any of the monastic activities. And at the same time, there is no interruption of the monastic activities because of the guests. Community was, in fact, the key feature of his monastic vision. Rather than writing for a collection of individuals competing against each other in their solitary quest for perfection, Benedict stressed the value of community life as a school for holiness. The community for Benedict was ideally suited for bringing individuals to their highest potential. Salvation, in effect, was a team effort. This view of the importance of community reminded me of a description Lutheran pastor Nadia Boltzweber wrote of the church she founded in Colorado. Her description of the church, in her description, she almost describes herself as an anti-Teresa. She acknowledges the value of Teresa's approach to spiritual matters, of Teresa's deep involvement in prayer and the importance of mystical experiences. But that's not Boltzweber's experience. This is what she wrote. I was recently asked by earnest young seminarian during a Q&A, Pastor Nadia, what do you do personally to get closer to God? Before I even realized what I was saying, I replied, what? Nothing. Sounds like a horrible idea to me, trying to get closer to God. Half the time I wish God would leave me alone. Getting closer to God might mean getting told to love someone I don't even like or to give away more of my money. It might mean letting some idea or dream of that is dear to my heart to let go of that dream. My spirituality is most active not in meditation, but in moments when I realize God may have gotten something beautiful done through me despite the fact that I'm an asshole. And when I'm confronted by the mercy of the gospel so much that I cannot hate my enemies, and when I'm unable to judge the sin of someone else, which, let's be honest, I love to do, because my own crap is too much in the way. And when I have to bear witness to another human being suffering despite my desire to be left alone, and when I'm forgiven by someone even though I don't deserve it, and my forgiver does this because he too is trapped by the gospel, and when traumatic things happen in the world and I have nowhere to place them or to make sense of them, but what I do have is a group of people who gather with me every week, people who will mourn and pray with me over the devastation of something like a school shooting. And when I end up changed by loving someone I'd never choose out of a catalog, but whom God sends my way to teach me something about God's love. But none of these things are the direct result of spiritual practices or disciplines, as admirable as those things may be. They are born in a religious life, in a life bound by ritual and community, by repetition, by work, by giving and receiving, by mandated grace. On one hand, we have Teresa, a saint who calls us into deep spiritual practice. And on the other hand, we have Benedict, who calls us into community and to find our salvation there. So here's the invitation and challenge I hear in the aspects of the lives of Teresa and Benedict I shared today, and I'll phrase them in the form of some questions for your reflection. How might you or we change your or our prayer life more rigorous, to make our prayer life more rigorous, thus opening our hearts wider to the still speaking God? How might you better embody Benedictine values of hospitality, service, and work? And how does and can this Christian community help bring you to your highest potential?